welcome to this week's All for All commentary. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and my writings and other works can be found at zerohourreport.com, or more information is available at rjeskow.com. This week, I've been thinking a lot about the power of collective activity and the nature of human beings as collective as well as individual beings. Why it is that we talk more about that now than we used to a decade or two ago, but not nearly enough. And I've been thinking about it for a couple of reasons. One of which is that I think it's the only way we're going to survive the civilization that's currently stifling us and throttling here in the Western countries and throttling the world elsewhere. So that's certainly one reason. The other is that if you've gone to any of the demonstrations of the past couple of years to end the genocide in Gaza, or the wave of demonstrations on April 5th against what the Trump administration is doing, hopefully you experienced the power and sense of completion that human beings can only experience in groups. It's impossible for us to exist singly and have that particular sense of fulfillment. I think it's certainly true for me and most people I talk to. And yet we still live in a world where the ideology is one of individualism über alles. My freedom is based on what I'm able to do, regardless of what you need. So I guess those are a few reasons why I've thought about it. And again, because the theme of this series is that our social imaginations need to catch up with our technological imaginations. And in fact, the two need to evolve together as one growing expression and fulfillment of human purpose. So again, we can't do that alone. I always refer back, for example, to the writings of the anarchist Peter Kropotkin, who expressed so eloquently why every so-called individual creation is really the product of an entire society working together, whether we recognize it or not. But it's better if we recognize it or not. I'm sorry, it's better if we do recognize it. And I guess one of the sort of aha moments for me goes back to when I was a typical liberal apparatchik consulting with the State Department on health financing, and also working with private corporations. And I first went to Hungary, my first trip behind the so-called Iron Curtain in the late 1980s. And there was an incident that stuck with me. I was getting on a trolley car with my guide and translator, and I didn't, somehow I assumed that since I was in a communist country, mass transit would not have fares, that you could ride the trolley car for free. Well, I turned out to be completely wrong about that, as I learned when an older woman gently touched my sleeve and said, "Comrade," and she went on, and with a smile on her face, kind of twinkle in her eye, but strict in tone too, said a few things that of course, I didn't understand, not speaking Hungarian. And I asked the translator what she had said. She had said, "Comrade, how will our comrades in the Ministry of Transportation continue to provide this service for the people if those of us who are able to support their work refuse to do so?" I mean, this was just somebody on a trolley car, but, and of course, we all know that communist government is no more. In fact, even then, there was a huge yearning for neoliberal change. And what they've got now is a totalitarian government like ours. But again, an aside, she really wanted to educate me. She didn't want to scold me or yell at me or "you cheater." She wanted me to understand why contributing my fare was important to the common good. And I thought about that afterwards. It just kind of stuck with me. I still think, by the way, that mass transportation should not have fares because it's a regressive tax. I think it should be paid for through income tax and other forms of tax. But that said, I took her point and I took it well. So maybe that was one of the things that got me thinking about collective social purpose, but it's by no means the only thing that got me pondering that. Another was, for example, I saw a documentary about North Korea at around the same time, and it was filled with the normal Western sense of superiority about with footage of South Korean children forming in a big stadium, forming the insignia of the flag and the face of the beloved leader, and so on. And the whole theme of the program was how brainwashed these poor people are. Now, I happen to be averse to top-down hierarchies like the North Korean government and cults of the leader like that. But so I didn't necessarily disagree entirely with the premise, but I remember thinking for a long time after that, wouldn't it be a good exercise if we all thought about and wondered about in what ways are we as off base in our thinking as those North Koreans seem to be to us? What is it that we share as a collective delusion? And one of the things we share as a collective delusion, or it certainly shared at that time, was as Margaret Thatcher put it, the idea that there is no society. There are only individual men and women and families. That's more insane than anything you'll find in North Korea, and yet it was a philosophy that remains one of powerful force today. So those were two things that got me thinking about this whole topic of society and collective purpose. As a sometime science fiction fan, I also was fascinated by the alien race on Star Trek called the Borg Collective. I was fascinated by the idea that the most horrifying life anyone could imagine, if you were certainly a writer of Star Trek, The Next Generation, or the shows that followed, most horrifying life possible was to be part of a collective where your individual knowledge was and what became part of the whole, your emotions, your feelings, your goals became part of the whole. It was enormously pro individualism, and yet I found something fascinating about it. And it also represented collective life as dreary. They were machines, half machine, half living. Their home was a giant cube with, it looked like a factory inside, as if collective purpose preempted any possibility of beauty. But the thing that really I didn't realize until later about the so-called Borg collective is they have a queen. There is someone called the Borg Queen. So it was not a collective in the true sense. It was a hierarchical organization. So it's more appropriate to think of the individual bodies within this single organism as drones, like drone bees, not as partners, comrades, parts of a collective. So that's something to bear in mind. But it also is fascinating. I was fascinated to look back later on some of the ways that the Borg were defeated in the Star Trek series by the heroes, and they are all absolutely awful techniques used by military empires in the 20th and 21st century. For example, you weaken the collective, so-called, by severing people's ability to share contact and therefore common purpose with the rest of the group. Or you introduce viruses. Admiral Janeway from Star Trek Voyager introduced the virus to the Borg that is germ warfare as biological warfare. Or you destroy critical infrastructure, much as Israel is doing in Palestine and Russia has been doing in Ukraine. So the Borg got me thinking, we don't really have a sense of the value and purpose of collective activity. I should probably also, in terms of science fiction, say a brief word about the 1956 film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because a lot of people, if you remember, that's the one where so aliens would put a pod in someone's basement and it would gradually take the shape of the person who lived there. Then they'd kill the person and replace them. That is an example of a disease whose name escapes me now, but it's something like it's a syndrome where you think the people around you are actually imposters. So it's a state of mental illness. But while it's been called an anti-communist film, there's nothing really anti-communist about it. It's more effective as a critique of excessive consumerism and individuality. So I think assuming that it's anti-communist is more about our socialist and political assumptions than it does about invasion of the body snatchers. But either way, you will be assimilated was the threat of the Borg, and resistance is futile was their slogan. But resistance is only futile in the real world if we don't do it together, if we don't march together, if we don't organize together, if we don't act as partners and comrades and allies together. Collectivity isn't an alien technology. It isn't a biological invasion from somewhere out there. Collectivity is the realization and fulfillment about something within us that is fundamentally human. Nor does it mean that we have to give up our individual selves. It means that by becoming selves that are part of something greater, we find complete purpose inside ourselves and outside ourselves, given if we are given the freedom to choose. So I would start with that, and then I want to pivot now to the concept of self-help as opposed to mutual help. So in that, I want to talk a little bit about the pastor Rick Warren. You may not remember the name Rick Warren, but there was a time in the 2000s when he was the most famous religious leader in America. His book, The Purpose-Driven Life, was released in 2002 and became a runaway bestseller. By 2020, it had sold an estimated 50 million copies, which shows that apparently a lot of people are looking for purpose. So what was it that drew them to Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life? Obviously, it's a very Christian book, and this is a Christian country, so it's grounded in a religion I don't happen to share. But there's a reason the book sold 50 million copies. People are desperate to give their lives meaning and purpose, and those are things most people don't feel today. Why should they? Most of us are struggling in unfulfilling jobs just to make ends meet. Who has time or energy for activities that give us a sense of meaning? Warren's twist on the self-improvement genre was to invert the idea that purpose comes from reaching your personal goals or your personal desires. He used a biblical quote in his introduction that read, as he quoted it, quote, "Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to finding yourself, your true self," end quote. Now, if that doesn't sound exactly like the Bible you might have known about, it sounds a little more modern and touchy-feely. Well, it's really from the Bible, in one translation. It's Luke 9:24, for those of you who know chapter and verse, from a translation I've never heard of before called the Message Bible. Wikipedia said that that translation is quote unquote highly idiosyncratic, end quote. Judging from that translation, I wouldn't doubt that for a minute. But if you take the quote out of its theological context and consider everything we're facing and facing terrifyingly alone, it's pretty sound thinking. Self-help won't save this planet or our society. Self-sacrifice will. It will help us find our true selves in the higher purpose of saving what is good and true about this world. Now, let's think also about that in the context of the environment. In big and small ways, doing what's needed can also make us healthier. Bicycling dramatically reduces carbon emissions, for example, as one of the authors of that study shows, quote, emissions from cycling can be more than 30 times lower for each trip than driving a fossil fuel car and about 10 times lower than driving an electric one, end quote. That author of the study adds, quote, urban residents who switched from driving to cycling for just one trip per day reduced their carbon footprint by about half a ton of CO2 over the course of a year and saved the equivalent emissions of a one-way flight from London to New York. Look, if we don't say dramatically reduce carbon emissions, let's face it, we're screwed. And if we don't stay in the best possible cardiovascular shape, ditto. So bicycling is a perfect example of other help that turns out to be self-help. When I lived in downtown Washington, I could walk or bike everywhere, and I did. I didn't even own a car. But here in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I live now, I can't do that. I'm on a cul-de-sac of small streets. It opens up to a 6-lane north-south thoroughfare. There's no direction I can go on a bicycle without taking my life into my own hands. That's bad urban planning, and it's bad for me individually. And yet, I've tried a few times. If I go out there on my bicycle, I feel like I'm in a cross between Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Duel with Dennis Weaver. Now, too often we think of these kinds of issues, do I drive a car or do I ride a bike, as matters of personal morality, but they're matters of civic morality. We don't need simply purpose-driven lives. We need a purpose-driven society. It's hard to live in it's hard to live in a green world. It's hard to live green lives unless we live in green communities. If we had a collective sense of purpose, we'd have more bikeable environments, but we do so much more. We'd use the full scope of our human imaginations, not to daydream or escape the miserable day-to-day truth of our existence, but to actually bring a better society and a better world into being. For example, if we had a collective sense of purpose that was healthy and strong, we would no doubt build up mass transit using technology as well as social cooperation, so that one day, instead of slaving at the workplace to meet our car payments and to pay for gasoline, we'd live in a world where, let's say, electric minibuses summoned by publicly owned apps could cruise up every street and cul-de-sac in the country. And when you wanted to go somewhere, you could have the same sense of purpose that that woman on the trolley car with me did in 1987, which is to say, a sense of mutual accomplishment just by going from point A to point B with people who are like you, who want to make the process of their day-to-day life something with meaning, something that contributes to a better world. Needless to say, especially here at Democracy at Work, if we had that sense of collective purpose, workers would influence and guide their own workplaces. And if studies are accurate, which I think they are, those workplaces would not only be more democratic or more equitable, they would do more to be socially accountable, to make sure that the work they do contributes to building a better society. In other words, a collective sense of purpose would change the way we live, not as an exercise in individual moral ambition, but through a shared sense of mission. We would see our sacrifices not as personal losses, but as further step toward meaning, meaning as individuals and meaning as a society. There's a writer I've mentioned before who has written a book that I believe is called A Heaven Made in Hell, based on an excellent premise, which is what happens when people experience a tragedy. What happens when communities must face, whether it's Bhopal after the Union Carbide disaster, or a Texas community that's had a bus accident killing many children there. I mean, there are many examples. They're terrible, terrible experiences. But what the writer does a good job of documenting is that in rebuilding from tragedy, those people found a sense of communal existence and communal meaning that gave them a deep and abiding sense of satisfaction. I remember myself after 9/11, I had just left a job that had me 2 blocks from the World Trade Center. My colleagues had moved into the World Trade Center. I knew a lot of people who died that day. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And I knew people who died afterwards as a result of the environmental impact. But I also remember going into my old neighborhood and other neighborhoods they were filled with tanks and troops and ruins and things we never thought we'd see on an American city street, that people were also looking out for each other in a way that felt deeply reassuring and deeply meaningful. I remember passing a hot dog vendor, and they could be very gruff in New York City, and my wife saying to him, "How are you doing?" And it was, "How are you doing?" It was maybe I'm not conveying it properly, but it was beautiful. And yet, how do we get from fear of the Borg to a sense that we're all in this together? Well, one clue, and this is not the answer for everyone, because the fact is it's not going to apply to everyone, but a start, something that we can learn from the socialist past and the low socialist history, is comradeships. It's very well described by Professor Jody Dean in her book Comrade, an essay on political belonging. She puts forward what she considers a theory of the comrade, and also a lot of historical anecdotes and literary quotations about the comrade. Now, the word comrade is obviously something that comes out of the communist movement, so it's never been a popular word in the United States, as it was, for example, in Hungary, when that woman told me, "Comrade, you have to pay for your fare for this." But we have now, and of course, comradeship is the opposite of Thatcherism. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and that's it. But Jody Dean does a great job of exploring what she's found out about comradeship. And I guess I would start by saying, before I quote Jody, that people have already experienced in this country in different ways a sense of something very similar to comradeship. For example, brothers in arms, people who have served together in the military, also used to be called comrades in arms, as well as foxhole buddies, understand the power and the bonding that happens when people serve, for example, in combat together. Well, every member of the armed forces in this country is part of a collective. They are comrades within a collective, and a government-run collective at that. So Jody Dean's theory of the comrade doesn't exactly apply to this, because Professor Dean focuses on communism, but that is a sense of shared purpose that people can achieve through comradeship. She writes, and I think is important, especially in the wake of the demonstrations we've seen recently, that the movement in the squares in Greece and Spain, which was new then, as well as the lessons from the successes and limits of the Occupy movement, have pushed against the left dogmatism that says that basically that politics is an individual virtue. They have re-energized interest in the party or the organization as a political form that can scale and that is flexible, adaptive, and expansive enough to endure beyond the joyous and disruptive moments of crowds in the street. I love that last phrase because it explains that, we have these wonderful moments of solidarity marching for a cause, but then that solidarity disappears. The way to preserve it is through an organization to which we all belong and whose goals we all share, so that it doesn't become something we briefly experience and then fades out of our lives. You can't make lasting change with these kinds of episodic uprisings or demonstrations, but those uprisings and demonstrations can help you build organizations that will make lasting change and that can do so, how shall I put it, in a way that continues to lift you up the way the moment of the demonstration lifted you up. So this is in contrast to what I would say is what today's capitalists, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and so on, want for you. What they want is the kind of dedication you see in a comrade, which is an extreme dedication to a cause, but they want that paired with the status of a slave. They want you as dedicated to their wealth as, let's say, political comrades are to the success of their movement. But that is, of course, the deepest and worst kind of exploitation. I should also explain that this experience of comradeship is not only important and meaningful, it can be deeply beautiful. Professor Dean quotes an activist who went to study in the Soviet Union. And he describes that visit in the 1970s. He said a Russian man with whom he was walking reached out to hold his hand. And then this is quoting the visitor to Soviet Union. He said, quote, "I had an urge to say I'm a linebacker, not a homosexual," end quote. That, of course, is the homophobia of the times. Then the quote continues, "I looked into the man's eyes and realized this was not a come on. It was simply a profound gesture of camaraderie. And I wanted to weep." This is, I can't tell you how beautiful I find that, but needless to say, in this case, the person visiting the Soviet Union was Black, and that man, the Russian, was white, but comradeship is not an instant antidote to racism. It is, in Jody Dean's word, a relationship necessary for constructing the new world, a relation present in and as the absence of property, nationality, and recognizable identity. In other words, you could say that as being, oh, I've been assimilated by the Borg, but you're not losing your Blackness or your whiteness or your personal history. You've got something stronger linking all that together in a greater cause. She also points out, Jody Dean, that is, that the absence of the idea of the comrade in US political theory could be a legacy of the Cold War. That's certainly true. But I would add to her observations about comradeship that it creates a kind of field of existence or a ground of being that you don't see or may not be aware of while the action takes place, but you certainly are aware of it the moment it disappears. Most people remember the routine in Monty Python's Life of Brian, the Judean People's Front versus the People's Front of Judea. When that unity is broken, I think you feel a deep sense of loss. Now, another quote of hers, that she exposes or shares when people say, comrade, they change the world. And one of Maxime Gorky, the writer's examples, is the prostitute who feels a hand on her shoulder and then weeps with joy as she turns around and hears that word, comrade. She's not a self-commodifying object to be annoyed by another at that point, or to be enjoyed by another at that point, but an equal in common struggle against the very conditions that require commodification. That is a breakthrough that is nothing short than spiritual, if I may use that word. And we'll return to that at some point in the future. But I think that it's important to recognize that comradeship is not a requirement, as Jody Dean writes about the writer Lillian Hellman. Like many intellectuals, Hellman valued independence over comradeship. And Jody Dean adds, this doesn't make her a bad person. Uh, that is really important. This is the idea of collective purpose, hopefully one that extends to all of society, will be addressed in different ways by different people. Some people will be genuine comrades fighting to be part of building a new world. Some people will be colleagues. Some people will be allies. Some people will be friends. But if we all have a sense of common purpose, without the need to have a tragedy beforehand, although tragedy may be unavoidable, we can find ourselves benefiting as individuals by benefiting each other as a society. And isn't that the point? Thanks for listening.